Hello everyone. Ever thought of people who are differently abled? And why are they called differently abled people? Because even if they are not normal like all of us, they have abilities which are higher than us. They have mental abilities or physical abilities which are stronger than us. In today's session, when we are going to start a new chapter, a visit to Cambridge, in which we are going to study little more or know little more about the legendary scientist Stephen Hawking, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce the author of this chapter also, Fido Kanga, because he is also another brave heart. Let's start with the session and know something about both of them. A Visit to Cambridge, written by Fido Kanga. Fido Kanga, born in 1960 in Bombay, is a writer and actor who lives in London. He has written a novel, Trying to Grow, which is a semi-autobiographical novel set in India, and a travel book, Heaven on Wheels, about his experiences in the United Kingdom. His novel, Trying to Grow, was turned into a fiction film named Sixth Happiness, for which Kanga wrote the screenplay and also starred. Firdaus was born in a Parsi family with a condition known as brittle bones disease. This left him with several painful fractures throughout his childhood and adolescence in India. But he adjusted to his disability early in life and was tough mentally. This chapter is also taken from his book Heaven on Wheels, which talks about his meeting with Stephen Hawking. This chapter is a story of a meeting of two extraordinary people. The scientist Stephen Hawking, who was paralyzed, but he did not let this come in his way of growth and success. He could not speak, but all he could do was punch the words on the computer which would speak on behalf of him. And then this interview is conducted by an author, writer, Fido Kanga, who himself is differently abled. These two great men exchange their thoughts on how the life is on a wheelchair, and they also talk about how the normal people react to them. Before we start with the reading and explanation of this chapter, let's know a little bit about Stephen Hawking.
Understanding how paradoxes between quantum mechanics.
The body had been ravaged by disease, but the mind soared into the cosmos. Stephen Hawking had even trained, hoping to get into space.
I could have gone on and on. Space, here I come.
His life would have been an inspiration even if he hadn't defied medical science and lived 50 years longer than a person afflicted with ALS, the muscle-wasting Lou Gehrig's disease, is supposed to.
I haven't.
And even if he hadn't, as he once told 60 Minutes, gone scientifically where no man had gone before.
For me, it is quite an achievement. I never thought I would get so far.
His physical limitations had, he said, freed his mind to develop brilliant new theories on the origins of the universe, or on what actually happened in space's black holes. And his ability to explain those theories using his computer-synthesized voice,
It makes us unique as transcending our limits.
and in his unlikely bestseller, A Brief History of Time, made him probably the most famous scientist of his generation. It earned him one of President Obama's first medals of freedom.
Professor Stephen Hawking was a brilliant man and a mediocre student.
Hawking's life story, depicted in the 2014 movie The Theory of Everything, might have been dismissed as a Hollywood fantasy if it wasn't true.
I reversed the process all the way back to see what happened at the beginning of time itself.
But he didn't need actors to play him. He was quite willing to play himself. On Star Trek,
I call.
Wrong again, Albert.
World's smartest
and
man.
on The Simpsons.
I wanted to see your utopia, but now I see it as more of a fruitopia.
But it's the science that endures, that and his message.
So remember to look up at the stars and not down at your feet.
Firdaus Kanga was on a walking tour in Cambridge, and that was the time when his guide reminded him that Hawking lived there. Firdaus Kanga had this urge of meeting this legendary scientist, a scientist who had taken over Isaac Newton's chair in the university. He was an astrophysicist and an author of the book A Brief History of Time. Of course, Firdaus Kanga wouldn't have gone from there without meeting this excellent scientist. Now let's read in the chapter what happens when Firdaus meets Hawking. This is a story of a meeting between two extraordinary people, both of them disabled and differently abled, as we now say. Stephen Hawking is one of the greatest scientists of our time. He suffers from a form of paralysis that confines him to a wheelchair. Paralysis is the loss of muscle function in a part of the body. And in this condition, the passing of the messages between the brain and muscles either stops or doesn't function properly, and allows him to speak only by punching buttons on a computer, which speaks for him in a machine-like voice. Firdaus Kanga is a writer and journalist who lives and works in Mumbai. The story which we are going to read today is about a meeting between two people, and both of these people are differently abled. These days we call disabled people as differently abled. One of them is Stephen Hawking, who is one of the greatest scientists, but he suffers from a condition, and because of this paralysis, in paralysis the messages between the muscles and the brain don't function properly, which is why there is no movement of the body parts. Now, since he cannot speak and he cannot walk, he is confined to a wheelchair, but there is a computer in front of him. He has to punch the buttons on the computer, and that computer speaks in a machine-like voice. Now, Firdaus Kanga is a writer and journalist who lives and works in Mumbai. Kanga was born with brittle bones that tended to break easily when he was a child. Like Hawking, Kanga moves around in a wheelchair. The two great men exchange thoughts on what it means to live life in a wheelchair and on how the so-called normal people react to the disabled. Firdaus Kanga is also differently abled because he was born with brittle bones, that is weak bones. And the bones were so weak that during his childhood, they used to break very easily. So, like Hawking, Kanga was also in a wheelchair. He also couldn't walk. And this story is the exchange of thoughts between these two men, and they talk on how these normal people react to the disabled. Let's read the chapter now. Cambridge was my metaphor for England. Metaphor is a figure of speech which identifies two unrelated things as similar or same. The writer says that Cambridge was his metaphor for England. By this, he means that Cambridge was the real England. In other words, that the essence of England or the real England could be seen in Cambridge. And it was strange that when I left, it had become altogether something else, because I had met Stephen Hawking there. At first, he thought that Cambridge was the only real England. But after he met Stephen Hawking, his thoughts were really changed and he left with a different mindset. It was on a tour through Cambridge that the guide mentioned Stephen Hawking. Poor man who is quite disabled now, though he is worthy successor to Isaac Newton, whose chair he has at the university. And I started because I had quite forgotten that this most brilliant and completely paralyzed astrophysicist, the author of A Brief History of Time, one of the biggest bestseller ever, lived here. The author Firdaus Kanga was on a walking tour through Cambridge during those times. And when his guide mentioned about Stephen Hawking, that he was living there, the guide told him that though Stephen Hawking was disabled now, but he is the true successor, means after Isaac Newton was the chairperson at the university, Stephen Hawking was the only worthy person who could be in his chair or who could be in the post of Isaac Newton. And then Firdaus Kanga realized that how completely he had forgotten about this brilliant, paralyzed astrophysicist. Astrophysicist is a scholar of astrophysics, which is a branch of physics dealing with stars, planets, etc. Stephen Hawking was the author of the book A Brief History of Time, which is also one of the biggest bestsellers ever of England. When the walking tour was done, I rushed to a phone booth and almost tearing the cord so it could reach me outside, phoned Stephen Hawking's house. There was his assistant on the line, and I told him I had come in a wheelchair from India. Perhaps he thought I had propelled myself all the way. Propelled means moved. To write about my travels in Britain, I had to see Professor Hawking. Even 10 minutes would do. Half an hour, he said, from 3:30 to 4. Now when the guide reminded the author that Stephen Hawking also lived there, he decided to meet him. And so the author went to the nearest phone booth and literally pulled the cord of the phone or the wire of the phone outside the booth because Firdaus Kanga was on a wheelchair and he could not enter the phone booth. So he had to pull the receiver to call Stephen Hawking. When Hawking's assistant was on the line, Firdaus Kanga told him that he had come specially from India to write about his travels in Britain, and he was also on the wheelchair. Now here in the bracket, this line, perhaps he thought I had propelled myself all the way, is a funny line here, which means that the assistant must have thought that he had actually or literally moved on the wheelchair from India to Britain. Well, the assistant gave him the appointment from 3:30 to 4 the next day so that Firdaus Kanga could meet Professor Hawking. And suddenly I felt weak all over. Growing up disabled, you get fed up with people asking you to be brave, as if you have a courage account on which you're too lazy to draw a check. The only thing that makes you stronger is seeing somebody like you achieving something huge. Then you know how much is possible and you reach out further than you ever thought you could. I haven't been brave, said his disembodied computer voice the next afternoon. Disembodied means bodiless. I have had no choice. After speaking to the assistant, Firdaus Kanga felt a little weak. Till now he had been courageous. But when he was growing up as a disabled, he or any disabled person gets fed up when people ask him to be brave. It seems as if they have a bank account of courage, but they cannot take out or withdraw the courage from that account because they are too lazy. In other words, people think that they are not being courageous or brave enough to accept their situation, while in reality it is the other way round. They are the bravest of all. But for these disabled people, the only thing that makes them stronger is when they come across another such person and when they see that the other person, other disabled person is also achieving something huge, irrespective of his physical condition, then it is the most courageous or it is the most positive thing for them. And then they get an inspiration that nothing is impossible. You just have to reach out further and you just have to open your thoughts and the possibilities around you. Through the last line, we come to know that now Firdaus Kanga has gone to meet Stephen Hawking the next afternoon. And Professor Hawking is saying that he had no choice. He had to be brave. The author calls Stephen Hawking's voice as disembodied computer voice because it was a voice which was spoken by a machine, a bodiless computer machine. So it had no feelings at all. Surely, I wanted to say, living creatively with the reality of his disintegrating body was a choice. Disintegrating means breaking in parts. But I kept quiet because I felt guilty every time I spoke to him, forcing him to respond. There he was, tapping at the little switch in his hand, trying to find the words on his computer with the only bit of movement left to him, his long, pale fingers. Every so often, his eyes would shut in frustrated exhaustion. Shut means close. Frustrated exhaustion means tiredness, which seemed to anger him. And sitting opposite him, I could feel his anguish. Anguish means anger. The mind buoyant with thoughts. Buoyant means intensely active and vibrant. That came out in frozen phrases and sentences. Stiff as corpses. Frozen phrases and sentences means feelingless words. Phrases which had words but no feeling. They were cold. Corpses means dead bodies. When Stephen Hawking told Firdaus that living like that was his choice because he had no other alternative, then Firdaus Kanga thought that how can a differently abled person choose to live creatively even with a paralyzed body? But Firdaus did not say anything. He kept quiet. And he kept quiet because every time he spoke, he was feeling guilty that he was forcing Hawking to respond. Now Stephen Hawking couldn't speak. All he could do was just press a few buttons on the computer and the machine would speak for him. So he used to tap a little switch in his hand and trying to find the words on the computer which could express his thoughts. And the only bit of movement that he could do was with his long, pale fingers. But every so often, his eyes used to close down because there was so much of tiredness which was causing him frustration. And why was that tiredness? Because he could not express properly what he felt. Firdaus was sitting opposite and he could understand his anger, his anguish, because he could understand that Hawking's mind was full of thoughts. It was active of thoughts. But these thoughts were coming out in phrases, in small sentences. And since these sentences or phrases came from a machine, they lacked the very feeling. And so they were cold and dead like dead bodies. Cambridge was my metaphor for England. This line is spoken by Firdaus Kanga, which means Cambridge had the England inside it. It was like the soul of England. So, in this part of the story, we learned that when Firdaus Kanga met Stephen Hawking, Firdaus Kanga was in absolute awe when he saw that how Hawking had come to terms with his disability and changed it into a different ability. Well, till now the story has been very inspiring. But in my next session, I'm going to continue with the story and let's know more about Stephen's thoughts on his life and his message to everyone. So wait for my next video wherein I'll be completing part 2 of this chapter. Till then, goodbye, take care and be positive.